The sterile walls of the Galactic Coalition debriefing center hummed with energy as Commander Kelnara shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her blue-scaled hands gripped the metal table, leaving small dents in the surface. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her reptilian features, highlighting the deep scars that crisscrossed her face like a map of old battles. Across from her sat two military historians, their recording devices capturing every word, every pause, every tremor in her voice. The room smelled of recycled air and metal polish. Outside the reinforced windows, the twin suns of Valorian Prime cast an orange glow across the military complex. Transport ships moved like insects in the distance, carrying supplies and personnel to various outposts scattered across the galaxy. But inside this small room, time seemed frozen. Commander, you've remained silent about your experiences with human forces for 3 years. What changed? Asked the lead interviewer, a thin Nexari with silver skin and eyes like black pearls. His colleague, a bulky Taurian with 4 arms, operated the recording equipment silently. Kelnara's compound eyes focused on a distant point beyond the walls, beyond the planet, perhaps beyond the present moment entirely. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, like someone trying to control panic. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and haunted memories. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. The human, they weren't like us. She paused, her clawed fingers drumming against the table's surface. You want to know what changed? Last week I attended a memorial service for fallen Coalition soldiers. When they read the names of the dead, all I could think about was how quietly humans died. No screaming, no begging. They just smiled. The P. Nexari interviewer leaned forward, his silver skin reflecting the room's harsh lighting. Commander, your psychological evaluation shows severe stress indicators. Perhaps we should start with something easier. Tell us about the state of the war before human contact. Kelnara's laugh was bitter, like acid eating through metal. Easier. Nothing about the Void War was easy. We were losing badly to the Devourer swarms. Our finest military minds, our most advanced weaponry, our centuries of tactical knowledge, none of it mattered against those creatures. She stood and walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the reinforced glass. The transport ships outside continued their endless dance, unaware of the conversation that would reshape galactic military doctrine. The Devourers came from dark space like a plague. They consumed entire star systems, turning living worlds into empty husks. Our fleets engaged them at Kepler Station, at the Rigel Nebula, at the outer colonies of the Andromedan cluster. Every battle ended the same way, retreat and heavy losses. Her voice grew quieter, more introspective. I commanded the 47th Tactical Squadron, elite troops, the best the Coalition had to offer. We prided ourselves on precision, on calculated risks, on minimal casualties. In 3 years of fighting, we maintained a 90% survival rate. We thought we were the finest warriors in the galaxy. The Taurian interviewer's 4 hands moved across his equipment, adjusting recording levels. What changed your perspective, Commander? Kelnara turned back to face them, her scales catching the light like blue armor. First contact with a species from a small yellow star, humans from a planet they called Earth. The initial reports described them as primitive, barely capable of interstellar travel. Their ships were crude metal constructs held together with welds and determination. Their weapons fired solid projectiles instead of energy beams. By all logical assessment, they should have been useless as allies. She returned to her chair, her movements careful and controlled, like someone walking through a minefield of memories. The Coalition High Command was desperate enough to accept any help, even from primitives. They assigned me as liaison officer to the 1st Human Military unit to join our forces. Her compound eyes focused on the recording devices, as if seeing something the machines couldn't capture. We expected primitive allies with crude weapons. What we got? She paused, her voice trembling like leaves in a storm. What we got were demons wearing friendly faces. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of machinery and the distant sound of spacecraft engines. Finally, she continued. The first human unit I encountered was led by Lieutenant Hansol, a young man with kind eyes who spoke softly to his troops. He couldn't have been more than 25 standard years old, barely an adult by coalition standards. His uniform was practical rather than ceremonial, marked with strange symbols I later learned represented his home region on Earth. Kelnara's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality as she recalled the details. Before their first joint mission with us, I watched him distribute small flat objects to his soldiers. Pictures, they called them, images of family members captured on paper and polymer, wives with bright smiles, children playing in green fields, elderly parents sitting in comfortable chairs. She shook her head slowly, as if still trying to understand what she had witnessed. I thought they were saying goodbye because they were afraid. Here were these primitives, about to face an enemy that had shattered coalition battle fleets, and they were looking at pictures of home. I assumed it was some kind of fear ritual, a way to find courage through sentiment. Her voice dropped to a whisper that the recording devices strained to capture. I was wrong. They were reminding themselves what they were fighting for. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over them like dust from a collapsed building. Outside, the twin suns continued their eternal dance, unaware that in this small room the foundation of galactic military understanding was beginning to crack. The first battle was on Kepler 7, Kelnara continued, her voice growing stronger. As the memories flooded back, she gripped the edge of the table, her blue scales rippling with tension. The planet was supposed to be a simple mining operation, automated extractors pulling rare minerals from the surface while our garrison kept watch. Then the Devourers came. She closed her compound eyes, reliving the moment when everything changed. I was monitoring communications from the orbital command ship when the distress signals started flooding in. The mining facility went dark first, then the perimeter outposts. Within hours, the entire surface was crawling with those nightmare creatures. The Nexari interviewer leaned forward, his silver skin reflecting the harsh lights. What did the Devourers look like up close, Commander? Kelnara shuddered. Imagine your worst nightmare, then make it worse. They stood 12 feet tall on 6, chitinous legs with mandibles that could slice through titanium armor. Their eyes glowed like dying stars, and they moved with a coordination that suggested hive intelligence. But the worst part was the sound they made. A clicking, chittering noise that seemed to burrow into your brain. She stood and paced to the window again, watching the peaceful transport ships outside. The Devourers had overrun our forward positions within the first day. Standard protocol demanded strategic withdrawal and orbital bombardment, level the entire mining complex, write off the losses, and establish a quarantine zone around the key. Planet. Her reflection in the window looked haunted, older than her actual years. I was preparing the evacuation orders when Lieutenant Hansol requested a private meeting. He walked into my command center with that same calm expression, carrying a tactical display pad and a cup of something he called coffee. Kelnara turned back to face the interviewers, her voice taking on an incredulous tone. This human, this primitive from a backwater planet, looked at our tactical assessment and said the situation was manageable. Manageable. We had lost 2,000 troops in 18 hours, and he called it manageable. The memory seemed to energize her, driving away some of the haunted quality in her voice. Lieutenant Hansol had other plans. While Coalition Command ordered all forces to retreat to minimum safe distance, the humans moved forward. I watched from the orbital platform as their dropships descended through atmospheric fire, landing right in the middle of the Devourer swarm. She began pacing now, her movements sharp and agitated. The human landing was unlike anything in our military manuals. No careful reconnaissance, no preliminary bombardment, no establishment of secure landing zones. They just dropped out of the sky like meteors and started fighting the moment their boots hit the ground. The Taurian interviewer adjusted his recording equipment with 2 of his 4 hands while taking notes with the others. What was your initial assessment of their tactics? Kelnara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Suicide. Pure, calculated suicide. I watched Private Dongwu, barely out of adolescence by human standards, charge directly at a devourer nest, with nothing but explosive charges strapped to his chest and a projectile weapon in his hands. Her voice began to break as she recalled the scene. The nest was a writhing mass of creatures, at least 50 devourers guarding their egg chambers. Any sane tactical analysis would have called for heavy artillery, maybe a controlled nuclear strike. But this human child, this boy who probably still wrote letters to his mother, just ran straight at them. She stopped pacing and stared at the wall, seeing something the others couldn't. He was singing. This human child was singing as he ran towards certain death, not screaming, not crying, not praying to whatever gods his species worshipped. Singing. A melody I later learned was about his home, about green fields and summer rain. The room fell silent except for the hum of recording equipment. Finally, Kelnara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Private Dongwu reached the nest perimeter and detonated his charges. The explosion vaporized him instantly, along with 37 devourers and their entire breeding chamber. In 15 seconds, one human accomplished what our tactical computers said would require a full battalion and acceptable losses of 60%. She resumed pacing, her agitation growing. But that was just the beginning. The human tactics made no sense by any military standard we understood. They used kinetic weapons when energy weapons were clearly superior, solid projectiles that relied on velocity and mass instead of sophisticated particle beams or plasma charges. The Nexari interviewer made a note on his datapad. Why do you think they preferred primitive weapons? Kelnara's compound eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Because their weapons never ran out of ammunition in the field, because projectile weapons could be manufactured from raw materials, because when their energy cells died or their equipment failed, they could still fight with metal and explosives. She turned back to the window, watching a squadron of fighters perform training maneuvers in the distance. They advanced when retreat was logical. Sergeant Yu Jin, a female human with scars covering both arms like decorative tattoos, led flanking. Maneuvers that should have been suicide missions. She took 12 soldiers through terrain our scouts had marked as impassable, emerged behind devourer positions, and began systematic elimination of their command nodes. Her voice took on an almost admiring quality. Yu Jin moved through the battlefield like death itself. Her squad communicated through hand signals and shared looks, coordinating attacks with a precision that would have impressed our elite units. But they did it while taking risks that would have gotten coalition officers court-martialed. Kelnara returned to her chair, sitting heavily as if the weight of memory was too much to bear standing. But they worked. Every impossible tactic worked. Every suicidal charge succeeded. Every desperate gamble paid off. In 6 hours they cleared a sector that had been lost for weeks, and they did it while taking casualty rates that would have broken any coalition unit. She looked directly at the recording devices, as if speaking to future generations who would hear her words. I watched the entire battle from orbital observation, analyzing their movements, trying to understand their strategy. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about warfare. Her voice grew quieter, more personal. The moment that broke my understanding came near the end of the battle. Corporal Minho had been hit by devourer acid, the kind that eats through combat armor like water through paper. He was carrying 3 wounded comrades to the evacuation zone, his own blood leaving a crimson trail behind him in the dust. She paused, her breathing becoming labored as she relived the memory. I ordered an immediate medical extraction for the corporal. Our medics were standing by, equipped with the finest surgical equipment the coalition could provide. But when they reached him, he refused treatment. The interviewers exchanged glances, sensing the emotional weight of what was coming. Minho looked at our chief medical officer, smiled through the pain, and said his squad wasn't secure yet. He had 2 more wounded soldiers to evacuate before he would accept help. Our medic explained that he was dying, that every minute of delay reduced his chances of survival. Minho nodded, thanked him for the information, and went back to carry his friends to safety. Kelnara's voice cracked completely. He died 3 hours later from blood loss. Our medical team said he could have lived if he'd accepted help immediately. His wounds were treatable, his injuries survivable. But that wasn't the human way. The room fell into the kind of silence that follows revelations too large to immediately comprehend. Outside, the twin suns continued their eternal dance, unaware that in this small room The foundation of galactic military doctrine was crumbling under the weight of human courage. The interviewer leaned forward as Kelnara's account grew more intense, his silver skin pale under the harsh lights. "Tell us about the Battle of Titan's Edge." Kelnara closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked like she might refuse to continue. Her blue scales rippled with barely contained emotion, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. "That's where I first understood what humans truly were. Not soldiers, not warriors, not even the demons I thought they might be. They were something far more dangerous." She opened her eyes and stared at the recording devices as if they were judges waiting to pass sentence. Titan's Edge was supposed to be a simple orbital defense platform, a massive structure built into an asteroid, bristling with weapons and shields. It guarded the approach to the Centauri system, protecting 3 billion civilians on the colonies below. The Taurian interviewer adjusted his equipment with practiced efficiency, all 4 hands moving in coordination. What made this battle different from Kepler-7? Kelnara stood and walked to the wall display, activating a holographic star map with a touch of her clawed finger. The projection showed the Centauri system, with Titan's Edge marked as a glowing red dot. The scale. At Kepler-7 we lost a mining facility. At Titan's Edge we were fighting for the lives of entire worlds. She manipulated the display, zooming in on the asteroid fortress. The Devourers had learned from their defeat at Kepler-7. They came prepared this time, with heavy artillery bioships that could crack planetary shields. Their assault began with a bombardment that lasted 6 hours straight. The hologram showed the battle formation, with dozens of organic-looking enemy vessels surrounding the asteroid. Our defensive positions were getting hammered, energy shields failing, weapon emplacements destroyed, entire sections of the station venting atmosphere into space. Within the first day we had lost 40% of our defensive capability. Kelnara's voice grew grim as she continued. The battle had been a disaster from the start. Coalition forces were pinned down by Devourer artillery, taking heavy casualties every time we tried to reinforce damaged sections. Our medical stations were overflowing with wounded, and our evacuation shuttles were being shot down faster than we could launch them. She turned away from the display, unable to look at the tactical overview any longer. That's when Captain So Young, the human commanding officer, made a decision that violated every military protocol ever written. I was coordinating defensive fire from the command center when she walked in, calm as someone ordering dinner. The memory seemed to physically pain her as she recalled it. Captain So Young looked at our casualty reports, studied the tactical display showing our trapped troops, and then did something that still haunts my dreams. She ordered her medics to the front lines, not behind cover, not to secured medical stations, but to the front lines where the enemy fire was heaviest. Kelnara's voice rose with incredulity. I thought she had lost her mind. Medics are protected under galactic warfare conventions. They stay in safe zones, treat the wounded, who are brought to them, and preserve medical resources for maximum efficiency. But this human captain wanted to send healers into active combat zones. She began pacing again, her movements sharp with agitation. I tried to reason with her, explained the protocols, the statistics, the logical deployment of medical resources. Captain So Young listened patiently, nodded at all the right moments, and then completely ignored everything I said. The Nexari interviewer made notes on his datapad. What was her reasoning? Kelnara laughed bitterly. She said coalition soldiers were dying because they couldn't reach medical stations, so instead of bringing the wounded to the medics, she would bring the medics to the wounded. Simple human logic that made no sense to anyone with proper military training. She stopped pacing and gripped the back of her chair, her claws leaving small scratches in the metal. The first medic to volunteer was Hyunwoo, a young man who had been treating wounded for 18 straight hours without rest. His medical pack was already damaged from earlier fighting, held together with tape and determination. Her voice grew softer as she recalled the scene. I watched from the command center monitors as Hyunwoo crawled through plasma fire to reach wounded coalition soldiers trapped in the outer defensive rings. Energy beams scorched the ground around him, and shrapnel from exploding walls tore holes in his medical pack, but he kept moving forward. Kelnara turned to face the interviewers directly, her compound eyes reflecting the room's harsh lighting. When I realized what he was attempting, I opened a direct communication channel and ordered him to return to safety immediately. That's when he said something I'll never forget. She paused, her voice trembling with emotion. Hyunwoo looked up at one of the security cameras, smiled through the smoke and chaos and said, "Commander, your people saved my world from invasion 50 years ago. Today, I save your people. This is how the universe stays balanced." The room fell silent, except for the hum of recording equipment and the distant sound of spacecraft engines outside. Finally, Kelnara continued. I had no idea what he was talking about. Later, I learned that 50 years earlier, coalition forces had helped defend Earth from an alien invasion. Hyunwoo's grandfather had been saved by a Nexari medic during that war. Now this human was repaying a debt that wasn't even his to pay. She walked back to the window, staring out at the peaceful scene of transport ships and training flights. I watched Hyunwoo drag my wounded soldiers to safety one by one, taking multiple hits but refusing to stop. Plasma burns covered his arms and back. Shrapnel had punctured his lung. His medical pack was destroyed, so he used torn pieces of his own uniform as bandages. Her reflection in the window looked ghost-like, haunted by memories that refused to fade. By the time reinforcements arrived, he had saved 17 coalition troops. Soldiers who would have died waiting for evacuation were alive because one human medic decided their lives were worth risking his own. Kelnara's voice cracked as she reached the end of the story. Hyunwoo died holding pressure on a wound, trying to save one more soldier, a Velkari communications officer whose leg had been nearly severed by devourer claws. The medic's own blood was pooling beneath him, but he kept working until his heart stopped beating. She turned back to the interviewers, tears flowing down her scaled cheeks. The most terrifying part wasn't that Hyunwoo died saving strangers. The most terrifying part was that he wasn't unique. Every human was like this. They treated their own mortality like a tool they could use, a resource to be spent for the benefit of others. The examples poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Private Ji-hoon held a critical bridge for 4 hours with a broken spine, directing artillery fire, while paralyzed from the waist down. He couldn't feel his legs, couldn't move without help, but he stayed at his post calling in targets until relief forces arrived. Her voice grew more frantic as she continued. Sergeant Yunji discovered a devourer broodmother trying to establish a new nest in the station's lower levels. Instead of reporting the location and waiting for a proper assault team, she detonated her own position to collapse the tunnel, trapping herself with the creature. Kelnara's compound eyes fixed on something beyond the walls, beyond the present moment. Before the explosion, she was laughing on the radio, laughing. She made jokes about finally getting a vacation, about how she'd always wanted to see what a brood mother looked like up close. Then she detonated enough explosives to level a city block, with herself at the center of the blast. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Kelnara's ragged breathing and the mechanical hum of the recording devices. Outside, the twin suns continued their eternal dance, unaware that in this small room, the foundation of galactic understanding was being rewritten by the memory of human sacrifice. "The incident that broke me happened on Proxima Station," Kelnara said, her voice barely audible. The interviewers had to lean forward to hear her, and even then her words seemed to drift away like smoke. Her blue scales had lost their luster, appearing dull and lifeless under the harsh lighting. She stood and walked to the far corner of the room, pressing her back against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. "I need you to understand something before I tell this story. Proxima Station wasn't just another military outpost. It was home to the largest human civilian population outside of Earth. Families lived there. Children played in the corridors. There were schools, markets, gardens where people grew flowers just because they were beautiful." The Taurian interviewer adjusted his recording equipment, sensing that something significant was coming. How large was the civilian population? "Commander!" Kelnara's compound eyes focused on the ceiling, avoiding direct contact with her interrogators. 12,000 civilians, mostly families of military personnel, but also researchers, engineers, merchants. The station had been operating for 15 years, long enough for children to be born there who had never seen Earth's sky. She pushed away from the wall and began pacing in tight circles, her movements restless and agitated. The station was humanity's last major foothold in the sector. After the disasters at Kepler 7 and Titan's Edge, it was the only significant human presence remaining in that part of the galaxy. If Proxima fell, the entire sector would belong to the Devourers. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, fed by the urgency of memory. The attack began on a Tuesday. I remember because the human children had been attending their weekly cultural classes, learning about Earth's history and traditions. The first Devourer ships appeared on long-range sensors during lunch period. She stopped pacing and gripped the edge of the table, her claws leaving fresh scratches in the metal. Within 6 hours, Devourer forces had surrounded the station completely, cutting off all escape routes. Their bioships formed a perfect sphere around Proxima, with no gaps large enough for even a single evacuation shuttle to slip through. The Nexari interviewer made notes on his datapad, his silver skin reflecting his concentration. What was the garrison strength? Kelnara counted on her clawed fingers. The garrison consisted of 300 human military personnel and 50 coalition troops under my command. Against a Devourer fleet of over 200 bioships, including 3 massive hive ships, each carrying thousands of warrior drones. She walked back to the window, staring out at the peaceful training exercises continuing in the distance. We had maybe 6 hours before their assault began in earnest. Standard military doctrine called for immediate evacuation of non-combatants, but there was nowhere to run. We were completely surrounded. Her reflection in the window looked older, more fragile than the woman who had begun this interview. Major Tae-hyun, the human commander, called an emergency meeting in the station's main conference room. I expected him to discuss surrender terms or evacuation plans. Every tactical computer on the station was running scenarios, and they all came to the same conclusion: total annihilation within 12 hours. Kelnara turned back to face the interviewers, her voice taking on a wondering quality. Instead, Major Tae-hyun talked about home, not military strategy, not tactical options, not even the impossible odds we faced. He talked about Earth, about the places these humans had come from before the war scattered them across the galaxy. She sat back down in her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. He showed us pictures of his daughter, Boram. She was 7 years old with the brightest smile I'd ever seen, missing her 2 front teeth. In the photo, she was wearing a yellow dress and holding a stuffed animal that looked like some kind of earth creature. The memory seemed to both pain and comfort her as she continued. Major Tae-hyun talked about how Boram loved to draw pictures of spaceships, how she wanted to be an explorer when she grew up. He said she had asked him to bring her back a star from his travels, and he had been trying to figure out how to explain that stars were too big to carry. Her voice grew softer, more intimate. Then Sergeant HR showed pictures of her parents' farm on Earth. Rolling green hills covered with some kind of grain crop, a small house with smoke rising from its chimney. She talked about how her mother made bread that smelled like heaven, how her father could predict the weather just by looking at the clouds. Kelnara paused, collecting herself before continuing. Every human in that room shared something about their home, their family, their dreams. Private Dong-soo talked about his girlfriend back on Earth, how he was planning to propose when he returned. Corporal In-ho described his son's first steps, how the boy had walked straight into his arms. The room fell silent, except for the hum of recording equipment. Finally she continued, her voice heavy with the weight of what was coming. After everyone had shared their memories, Major Tae-hyun stood up and outlined his plan. It was insanity in its purest form. They would overload the station's main reactor, creating an explosion large enough to eliminate the entire Devourer fleet. The blast would be visible from 3 star systems away. Her compound eyes fixed on the recording devices with laser-like intensity. No one would survive. The explosion would vaporize the station instantly, along with everyone aboard. 12,000 civilians, 350 military personnel, all gone in a flash of nuclear fire. Kelnara's voice cracked as she recalled her response. I protested. I begged them to find another way. Surely there was some alternative, some tactical option we hadn't considered. I ran through every scenario I could think of, fighting retreats, negotiated surrenders, even hiding in the station's deepest levels until rescue arrived. She stood again, unable to remain seated while reliving this memory. But Lieutenant Jae-min, a young man barely old enough to shave, just patted my shoulder with genuine kindness and said, "Commander, 50 of our friends will live if we do this. That makes it easy math." Her voice rose with incredulity. Easy math. 50 coalition troops would escape in the confusion of the explosion. 50 lives saved in exchange for 12,350 lost. To humans, that wasn't a tragedy. It was a victory. She walked to the wall display and activated the holographic projector again, showing the tactical situation around Proxima Station. I spent the next 2 hours trying to change their minds. I showed them the numbers, the statistics, the cold mathematical reality of what they were proposing. But every argument I made only seemed to strengthen their resolve. Kelnara manipulated the display, zooming in on the station itself. The humans spent their final hours writing letters they'd never send and recording messages for families they'd never see again. The station's communication systems were jammed, so these messages would die with them. But they wrote them anyway. Her voice became almost hypnotic as she described the scene. I watched grown soldiers weep as they recorded bedtime stories for children who would never hear them. Engineers wrote detailed instructions for repairing farm equipment on worlds they'd never visit again. Scientists recorded their final observations about alien life forms, hoping somehow the knowledge would survive. She turned away from the display, unable to look at the tactical overview any longer. Private Da-un, barely 18 years old, found me sitting alone in the observation deck. She had been crying, but her eyes were clear and determined. She sat beside me and taught me a human song about stars. Kelnara's voice became barely audible. The song was about how stars were the souls of heroes, watching over the living from the darkness of space. Da-un had a beautiful voice, clear and pure like crystal chimes. She sang it 3 times until I could follow along. She closed her eyes, and for a moment it seemed like she could hear the melody again. When the time came to overload the reactor, all 300 humans gathered in the station's central plaza. They had moved the civilians to the evacuation pods, launched them just before the reactor reached critical mass. Her breathing became labored as she approached the climax of her story. I was supposed to evacuate with the civilians, but I couldn't leave. I had to see how it ended. So I hid in an observation pod, watching through reinforced windows as the humans prepared to die. Kelnara opened her eyes, tears streaming down her scaled cheeks. When the reactor went critical, they were holding hands in a circle, singing. That song Da-un had taught me. 300 voices raised together, singing about stars and souls and the endless dance of light in darkness. Her voice broke completely. They faced complete annihilation with joy because they knew their sacrifice would save others, not just the 50 coalition troops, but the billions of civilians in surrounding systems who would be safe from the devourer. Fleet. She walked to the window one final time, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. I was the only survivor from the military garrison, ejected in an escape pod moments before the explosion. I watched 12,350 souls die in cleansing fire, ended by 300 humans who chose death over defeat. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Kelnara's quiet weeping and the mechanical hum of machines recording the end of innocence. The interview room fell silent as Kelnara finished her account, the weight of her words settling over them like dust from a collapsed star. Her compound eyes fixed on the recording devices with an intensity that made the machines seem almost alive, as if they too understood the magnitude of what they had captured. She remained motionless for several minutes, her blue scales rippling, with barely contained emotion. The twin suns outside had shifted position during the long interview, casting different shadows through the reinforced windows. Transport ships continued their endless dance in the distance, carrying personnel and supplies to various outposts, unaware that the conversation in this small room would reshape galactic military doctrine for centuries to come. "You want to know why I can't serve anymore?" Kelnara finally asked, her voice carrying a hollow quality that made both interviewers lean back instinctively. "It's not because of what the humans did, it's because of what they made us become." She stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate like someone walking through a minefield of memories. Moving to the wall display, She activated the holographics projector one final time, showing a galaxy-wide tactical overview marked with battle sites and coalition military installations. After the Void War ended, something strange began happening across coalition space. Other species started adopting human tactics, human philosophies, human ways of thinking about warfare and sacrifice. Her clawed finger traced paths between star systems on the display. It wasn't ordered from high command. It wasn't part of any official training program. It just happened, like a virus spreading through our military culture. The Nexari interviewer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his silver skin reflecting the holographic light. "Can you give us specific examples, Commander?" Kelnara manipulated the display, zooming in on the Velkari home system. The Velkari were always known for their cautious, methodical approach to warfare. They preferred siege tactics, slow advances, minimal casualties. But after serving alongside humans, their military began developing what they called honor charges, direct assaults on enemy positions that had previously been considered suicide missions. She moved the display to show another star system. "I witnessed a Velkari unit attack a Devourer stronghold 6 months after Proxima Station. Instead of their traditional careful bombardment, followed by systematic advance, they charged the enemy positions while singing traditional Velkari war songs. Songs that had been ceremonial for centuries suddenly became battle cries. Her voice took on a wondering quality. The Nexari developed concepts of honor death, the idea that dying for others was the highest form of service. Before human contact, Nexari culture emphasized individual achievement and personal survival. Afterward, their military academies began teaching courses on noble sacrifice. The Taurian interviewer's 4 hands moved nervously over his equipment. "What about your own species, Commander? How did the humans affect coalition doctrine?" Kelnara turned away from the display, her compound eyes reflecting the artificial light like jewels. The Zephyrians began training soldiers to fight through fatal wounds, to continue combat effectiveness even when dying. We developed new medical protocols not to keep soldiers alive, but to keep them functional long enough to complete their missions. She began pacing again, her movements more agitated than before. Our military psychologists started studying human, emotional responses, trying to understand how they maintained morale in impossible situations. We began incorporating human concepts of camaraderie, of fighting for abstract ideals rather than concrete objectives. Her voice grew more intense. Most disturbing of all, we started carrying personal items into combat. Pictures of family members, letters from home, small objects with sentimental value, things that had no tactical purpose but somehow made us fight harder, care more, risk everything for people we barely knew. Kelnara stopped in front of the recording devices, staring directly into their sensors. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was their ability to make others want to be like them. They infected us with their madness, their beautiful, terrible madness. She walked back to the window, pressing her palm against the reinforced glass. Captain So Young's final words haunt me most. Before leading the charge that saved Proxima Colony, she had smiled at me with that terrible human confidence and said, "Commander, we don't fight to die. We fight to make death mean something." The memory seemed to physically pain her as she continued. "I didn't understand at the time. Death was death, the end of existence, the failure of all biological imperatives. But humans saw it differently. To them, death was just another tool, another resource that could be spent wisely or wasted foolishly." She turned back to face the interviewers, her scales catching the light in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. "The galaxy fights wars the human way now. Other species send their children into battle singing songs about home. They carry pictures of loved ones into combat zones. They choose impossible odds because saving others is worth any price." Kelnsara moved toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the small room. "I attended a Nexari military graduation ceremony last month. The cadets took an oath that would have been unthinkable before human contact. They swore to value the lives of others above their own, to face any danger for the sake of innocent beings they would never meet." She paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the door controls. "I've seen Taurian engineers sacrifice their lives to repair damaged ships, staying behind to ensure others could escape. I've watched Velkari medics run into active fire zones to treat wounded enemies, following protocols they learned from humans. Her voice grew quiet, almost reverent. I've seen the face of true courage, and it belongs to a species that should have been the weakest in the galaxy. Every night I dream of Sergeant Yu Jin laughing as she charged a devourer nest. I dream of Medic Hyunwoo refusing medical treatment so others could be saved first. I dream of 300 humans holding hands as they chose to die for people they barely knew. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the corridor beyond. Kelnara paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the brighter light outside. Humanity didn't just save the galaxy from the devourers. They saved us from being the kind of people who would let evil win because fighting it was too dangerous. That's their true legacy, not the battles they won, but the courage they taught us to find in ourselves. She stepped through the doorway, then turned back one final time. The question isn't whether we're better soldiers now. The question is whether we're better people. And that's something each species will have to answer for itself. Kelnara walked down the corridor, her footsteps fading into silence. The two interviewers sat in stunned quiet, processing what they had just witnessed. The recording devices continued their mechanical humming, capturing the aftermath of a revelation that would reshape galactic civilization. Outside, the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Transport ships continued their endless dance, carrying the seeds of human philosophy to every corner of Coalition space. The galaxy had been changed by contact with a single species, infected with ideals of sacrifice and courage that would echo through the ages. In the silence that followed, the Nexari interviewer finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Are we better or worse for having met them? The Taurian's response was equally quiet. I think that's the wrong question. The right question is, what do we do with what they've taught us? The recording devices captured both questions, preserving them for future generations who would struggle with the same impossible choice between safety and sacrifice, between survival and service, between the easy path and the right one. The interview was over, but the conversation it started would continue for as long as sentient beings looked up at the stars and wondered what they were willing to die for. The legacy of humanity spread through the galaxy like light from a distant star, invisible until it illuminated everything it touched, changing the nature of courage itself. The end.